enjoyed and been well informed by part 2. So here's the beginning of part 3, which is part 2 of part 2. So if you're not confused now, anyway, please enjoy this insightful look from some of the world's best geopolitical commentators and contributors about the transition to multipolarity and about the need for multipolar peace in a world that's filled with troubles.
Right. There's a lot of speculation going on about there's going to be a new payment system, there's going to be a BRICS currency. I'm skeptical of all of that. It's not necessary, and it would actually create a single target for Western disruption. Also, it's technically and politically difficult to agree for a payment system that's going to be global to operate under one jurisdiction's laws and rules. And every payment system has to have a jurisdiction. So I can't see them all agreeing that they're going to allow any of them, as much as they like collaborating within BRICS, to have absolute control over jurisdiction of the new payment system. So I actually believe what BRICS tells us, and BRICS tells us that they want local currency trade. That you can choose any currency you want to do business in. The alternative to the dollar is the dollar and all other currencies. And what they want is for particularly the global East and South to do more trade, and we're talking trade here, in each other's currencies. ASEAN has unanimously agreed to this in May of last year and is working towards that, doing more business, making their payment systems interoperable with each other's banks. That's the right direction ahead. And none of that requires massive innovation or a new treaty to get done, because China has expanded access to its CIPS payment platform for yuan, but also has the Hong Kong yuan, which it is doing increasing business out of Hong Kong. And that is consistent with the way banks operate today. It doesn't require any particular innovation within the banks. Virtually every big bank today is multi-currency. They're used to managing in multiple currencies, multiple ledgers. So to move to local currency trade is just an extension of that trend. And it doesn't have to be disruptive even to the Western global economy. And the reason for that is that trade is actually an incredibly tiny amount of what moves in global capital markets. All trade in good, everything that moves by rail and ships and lorries, anywhere in the world, totals about $48 trillion annually. It's tiny compared to the flows in capital markets, where bond markets are about, I think about 380 billion or trillion. Equity markets, probably about 200 trillion. Derivatives, if we just even looked at the margin movements in derivatives, probably only about 400 trillion. Secured interbank credit is about 1,900 trillion. So 48 trillion as a percentage of that is virtually unnoticeable. So as long as the capital markets of the world stay dollarized and continue doing what they're doing, they probably won't notice when trade in real goods moves into other currencies. Even oil, we probably won't notice it. Oil is only 8 trillion of the global trade. It's tiny. So if some of that de-dollarizes, we probably just won't notice. And that's, I think, the safest route forward for BRICS, is to do things practically, pragmatically, bilaterally, because all trade is agreed bilaterally, and do it in a way that more or less passes by unnoticed.
We're starting to see a bit of that happening also in Southeast Asia, as you mentioned. And I guess my thinking is that a lot of these elements, I guess, of transnational or international interactions can help create the institutional environment that can act as something of a bulwark against the madness of the war machines, if you will, because there's actually a lot at stake for countries that continue to have primary ambitions around economic development to improve the livelihoods of their peoples.
Yes,
Hussein,
I wish I had a
sorry,
government that
Kathleen.
did that. Um, I do want to add, there is some infrastructure that does need building. I actually want to build it. I built the global interbank credit markets that are now 18 trillion a day. I wrote the very first tri-party repo. And at the time we were told the world didn't need it, banks wouldn't use it. And it's now a huge interbank daily market. The difficulty with the 80 currencies where governments have made commitment to move to local currency trade is that there is not interbank liquidity at scale in those 80 currencies, even yuan. Yuan global liquidity is mostly provided by ICBC, which now has 12 global clearing centers for yuan. But I would like to build the solution for those 80 currencies to be as liquid as dollar, yen, euro, sterling, Swiss franc. If anyone wants to introduce a VC for that, I'm open.
Well, let's
You need
let's
more
keep
than
our eyes.
VC. That's a pretty big undertaking, Kathleen. I have a question for you.
But this is what I do. I globalized U.S. dollar. I globalized U.S. treasuries. I created the interbank markets a generation ago.
Kathleen, that's great. I want to ask you a question. I was an investment banker. I was in charge of my city's finances and things like this. A lot of the movement that you're talking about in terms of liquidity is not going into what I would call the real economy. It's not, capital markets are there to provide not liquidity for banks, but they're supposed to actually do things. Companies are supposed to invest in things like that. And instead, what we see is a massive casino where entities are just making bets and things like that. So I would caution about thinking that somehow volume equals progress. But I do agree with you. There is a solution.
There is a kinetic economy in real world goods and trade where that 48 trillion needs to move. And then there is the financialized economy, which has been over leveraged for the last 30, 40 years,
yes.
Which is heavily dollarized and will continue to be heavily dollarized. I think actually some of
Kathleen, what happens when people stop buying U.S. Treasuries because there's too many U.S. Treasuries and not enough buyers? I mean, central banks right now are at their lowest point. The only reason that people are buying them is because it's the U.S. and it has high rates. Once those rates go down, there's going to be a problem. That's why, what's her name?
Janet
U.S.
Yellen.
Treasury. Yeah, when Yellen was over here, she was asking the Chinese government to put nearly $1 trillion into bond sales. It was somewhere around 900 billion. When she left, the Chinese immediately bought gold. I think that can tell you something.
Well, I watched the Treasury data on foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries very closely. I look at it every single month as soon as it's published. So I'm very aware of the trends, and China has been divesting ever since the first sanctions on China, basically in 2012, 2014. It's been diminishing its holdings of U.S. Treasuries. So it's part of a long trend of China de-risking. It's accelerated since the Russian sanctions and the Russian expropriations of Russian assets. And that's just sensible risk management, which the leadership of the People's Bank of China has made clear that just as a matter of risk management, they don't want to be exposed to a creditor that defaults on their debts whenever it gets inconvenient or they don't like anybody.
Going back to your original thing that the dollar is going to stay there, I'm just wondering how that analysis works with the other analysis.
Well, I've got an analysis. I've got a theory. It's supported now by data, but at the time it was just a theory that in October 22 at the IMF meetings, Yellen got the rest of the central banks in its sort of allies camp to agree to something that's called, I call it a daisy chain, where they do stealth quantitative easing to create money to buy each other's debt. And if you look at the numbers, it's now clear that did happen in October 2022. They are buying each other's debts. They're booking it as central bank official reserves. And it's allowed them to sustain at least the appearance of liquidity in their bond markets.
Well, this will be fun to watch the rollout.
So
I
mean,
wonderful stuff, Kathy. If you can send me, I'd be very interested in that and making sure that that's published.
Well, the data is a bit. You have to be really kind of a data freak about this stuff, because it shows up in the tick data, yes, but it also shows up in the IMF reported quarterly official reserves. But it doesn't break it. The IMF data does not break it out by central bank by central bank. So I don't have the staff or the funding to really do the work that it deserves to show the daisy chain. But it does show broadly in the inflections in holdings of official reserves.
It's got to be happening somewhere, right? So now, moving off the finance stuff, perhaps, but I'm not sure who had their hand up first. It might have been Hussein. If it is, or if
yeah,
it was John,
I just wanted to
John,
comment on what
Hussein.
what Kathleen described in terms of the volume of financial paper being traded. That is maybe 100 times more than the real economic needs of the world population. And Einar's reaction to that's the core of the crisis we have today. We have a failing, bankrupt financial and banking and economic system in the West, which is going down. And we have a rising economic system spearheaded by China, but not only China, but most of Southeast Asia, India, now Russia, and even the Arab countries and Africa. This dichotomy, this imbalance in the world is the source of a lot of the crises we have today. All this money which is circulating in the financial markets, just hot air. It should be all written off because this is the casino. This is not reality. Reality is what China and the others are doing. They're focused on using money as a tool, political tool for physical, economic, social, and cultural development. We are not doing that. Since the financial crisis in 2008, through quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the EU Bank, and the Japan Bank, they produced more than $24 trillion. And where did that go? It did not go to infrastructure, or it went to speculators, gamblers. China, since 2008, also produced around 14 to 18 trillion equivalent trillion dollars of credits through the government banks and other financial markets. And that was used exclusively to build infrastructure, industry, scientific and technological projects, including the high-speed rail, which is amazing everybody. That was a product of that. So there's a philosophical difference in the thinking. We had that in the United States and Europe. In the United States, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he controlled the banks, said the banks should work for the people, and they built infrastructure more than what China is doing now, comparatively. That's what made America great. That's what made America fight World War II. It was Roosevelt's policy, the New Deal, the infrastructure development projects, the urbanization, electrifying the countryside. We had the same in Europe, in Sweden. We used state funds, pension funds to build highways, railways, nuclear power plants. So this was all shifted in the 70s when the Bretton Woods system was. Now, this is where we have the conflict, actually. Part of the conflict is that we have the West is going down economically and the rest of the world is going up. And that friction is a source of the conflict we have today. So all this financial paper is a big burden, is a cancer, actually, on the people of the West, but also is creating all the problems in the West. So we need to reform the financial system in the West and go back to financing the real economy, that for each dollar, you have to have an equivalent in reality, not like we have $1 in production, and then you have $1 billion in financial speculation. Every day in the Swedish financial market, currency is traded for the whole Swedish GDP in a year, in one day. People buying and selling currency using supercomputers for trillions of dollars every day. You know, is that just completely insane?
I
And this is
I actually
Yeah,
built
you know,
CLS Bank.
Look, what
So, and
well, it seems
it does settle 7.5 trillion a day in foreign exchange transactions in just 18 currencies. I was the domain lead on that with IBM to build it. So yeah, I take responsibility. I did that, and that's now 1,900 trillion a year in foreign exchange trades, and none of that has to do with anything moving in the real world. So it is entirely just a casino.
look. It
you know,
seems that
as they say in the movie Wolf of Wall Street, it's all fugazi. You know, he goes, fugazi, wazi, gazi, who knows? So that's what the whole the global economy has
It
become.
seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, and look, but
Yeah,
it seems to me that what's happening in the world at the moment, I mean, a lot of the headlines, I guess, revolve around things like NATO and stuff, but there's actually a whole series of underlying structural shifts going on in the way that economies work and how resources are deployed and what the balances are in domestic economies and how that spills over into international tensions. Digby, I'm going to jump this one into your direction because a couple of days ago you did a video about some of these things, which I actually I watched it twice, once quickly and then once more thoroughly, and I thought it was an absolute tour de force in the way that it connected what's going on in the economy, if you will, the global structure of the economy as the foundational or bedrock piece to these other elements that we often spend a lot of time talking about. Could you just, if you could, just help us connect and help our viewers connect these dots together a little bit?
Yeah, I hope so. When we talk about really large numbers, you know, many, many trillions of dollars, I think the vast majority of the audience just their eyes glaze over because it just seems incomprehensible. The situation, the predicament that the Americans have got themselves into, which is that because they've got the reserve currency and the exorbitant privilege, they're able to print money at will to pay whatever debts they want, and that can be inflated away. Those debts can be inflated away. But what this also means is that it enables them to support the economies of their allies, and that's clearly what they've done. Just a little history to say that Japan's economy was rebuilt and Germany's economy was rebuilt after World War II with the US funds, and of course the Soviets were excluded from that, and then the finger was pointed at them saying that, you know, they don't know how to run their economy. Well, of course they couldn't because they didn't get access to capital. But that's true, of course, of other countries like China, for example. So what that means is that they support the alliance network through access to the US economy. And so when the US economy was strong, let's say relatively strong, it was able to import at will, you know, from Germany, Japan, the UK, and everywhere else. And of course, those countries took great advantage of that. I don't want to go into the details of the sort of 1971 decision to unpeg to gold, but what it meant was that since that time, the United States has had a weakening relative, you know, its economic strength relatively has decreased, yet the exports from countries like Germany and Japan and Europe generally, and of course later China, have increased. And so the Americans, of course, need to sustain that, to sustain their alliance network. Because if Japan and Germany are not exporting to the US, well, they're going to be a lot less interested in whatever the US wants. So to do that, they have continued to print money so that they can import. So these are the basis of all their deficits, basically, their import deficits. And so as they've done that, they have also then turned around and said, well, now we have to put limits on the exports of their allies. So Korea and Japan and Germany and so forth have all had their exports to the US limited. Trump was the most recent example of that. Just a few years ago, and made a big kerfuffle about he was going to destroy the alliance network, etc. But that's just evidence of what I'm saying, and that is that as the US its debts increase, its deficits are still increasing, and it has to maintain imports from its allies, because otherwise their economies will suffer even more greatly than they are. And now what they've done is they've taken away the basis, for example, of the European economy, access to cheap energy, and weaken those economies even further, which makes them more reliant on exports, but they can't increase their exports into the US economy. And so you add China into that mix, which is exporting at with very much better technology in EVs, for example, the vast majority of legacy chips, and much more. And then you see that this is one of the great reasons, or one of the main reasons, that the United States is having economic warfare against China, is because it weakens the American economic position and its ability to maintain the alliance structures through imports from those countries. And then you add on to that car manufacturing is the world's largest business, I mean, by far. And everything that goes with that supply chain, so the glass and the plastics and the wheels and you name it, whatever it is, that is enormous, and of course fuel as well. So the advent of cheap EVs, and I just saw a tweet about 10 minutes ago where BYD is releasing a hybrid car for less than $12,000 that'll do 2,000 kilometers. Now, there's no way that Mercedes and Citroën and Fiat and Honda and Toyota, etc., can compete with that. So that means that the import market in America is also changing, that nobody wants to buy those old cars anymore. And you have to imagine that Germany exports 75% of its cars to overseas markets. So yes, in Europe and in Asia, but a lot to America. And so there's this very strange predicament now where the US is no longer the primary market for exports of its allies. So China is the largest trading partner of all of those allies, and offering them goods that are much cheaper, and undermine that in effect undermines their export economies, and they've been cut off from cheap energy as well, and now they're being asked to increase their defense spending. So the key to that is that as they increase their defense spending, it's quantitative easing. I mean, basically, famously Biden said, what was it, that the 60 billion we're sending the Ukraine, 90% of it's being spent in America. So this is really just subsidizing the American economy through defense expenditure. And it explains why they need to create tensions in Asia. And it explains why there needs to be, propaganda about danger and threats and invasions and so forth, because you need to increase your arms sales and you need to solidify your industrial base. So this is a lose-lose situation for the Americans, and it makes me wonder exactly how far they can really go. And honestly, at this point in time, I think I'm calling the two presidential candidates the straw man, which is Biden, just fall over. He can't even walk anymore, let alone string a sentence together. And the tin man, Donald Trump, who's going to insist that everybody pay more money. He's going to put on more tariffs, which is a tax on American taxpayers, reduce their efficiencies, and it's only going to make their situation worse. So I wonder whether, 2008, then the pandemic, and this would be, I think, and maybe Kathleen can correct me on this one, but it'll be the longest time that there has not been a crash, a major crash. So 2008, we maybe not include the pandemic, but 2008 to 2024, that would be the longest time, pretty well in modern history, that a liberal economy like the American economy has not had a crash. And so that is it's on the vapors of the US currency. And when the US stock market is now at an all-time high, it reminds me of 1929 in the worst possible way. And I wonder whether they can actually get to November. And if they do get to November, what's going to happen after? And I think this kind of last roll of the dice of NATO in Asia is really just to spur that spending again, to increase spending. And that's why they immediately called for a 2.5 percentage point increase. And then Canada turned around and said, oh, we're not even going to get to 2% until 2032. So, and where are they going to get the money from? I mean, seriously, the only way is to print it. And this is only going to weaken the position further. So it's, as Hussein said, it's a bubble. And it's going to crash sooner or later. It's inevitable. And I think I've been waiting for it for 5 years, but it's still going to, I'm pretty sure it's going to happen.
The constraint, it seems to me, is that you can print as much of the liquidity that you want. The problem that's being confronted is the problem of physics and the availability of materials and skilled people to actually do what it is that the ambition and the printing press wants to do.
Yeah, well, in that article you were talking about, I referred to that problem, that very problem. So China's pumping out engineers and scientists with advanced degrees at a very large rate to be able to manage and organize their economy. Whereas you find that, all the brightest people in the United States are going into finance because they think they can make a lot of money very quickly, and they're not building anything anymore. And I think that's true. The French are exporting their brains out of their universities. So there's a reverse brain drain going on here in a real sense. It's not a river yet, but it's definitely heading that way. The brains are all they're going to follow the money, and the money's in Asia. It's Asia that's got sort of collectively a 6% GDP growth. The so-called advanced economies are all in recession.
And perhaps that partly explains why the Americans have also been, I guess, very let down by Modi's visit to Russia, because there has been some very clear signals made that there were great hopes that India would provide the American economy with a pipeline of young people who would become educated in the STEM areas, for example. SL, any sort of thoughts on that front? Because I saw it reported recently that in the kerfuffle about foreign students in America, that the ambition was for Chinese students to go to America to study the humanities, but for Indian students to go to America to study science, technology, and engineering. And this seems to be partly a recognition that there is an insufficient pool of capable, well-skilled, well-educated workers to actually deal with these challenges going forward. And they're hoping to actually take them out of India and not send them back.
Yeah, I think it will work for a short while, because it's just a Band-Aid on the bleeding American society. It's such a tragedy that the US ranks at the bottom of, the OECD countries in terms of education. It ranks like 32nd in the world for math, reading, and basic stuff. It's so sad. And, right after World War II, they got a lot of brilliant minds from Europe, who came to the US, and they built everything. The US even stole the semiconductor technology from German scientists, and then they gave themselves the Nobel Prize for the transistors. And then, the last few decades, they were able to live off the fresh pool of educated people from the developing nations who are so eager to work hard and study hard in the US. But that kind of a scheme is going to run out, because 10 years from now, the situation, like in India, will be much better. And then a lot of the US educated people and with job experience, they're going to come back to India, and they're going to start their own software companies and semiconductor design companies and all of that. So this sort of the dependency on foreigners to come and do the work. And it's just, Americans don't want to do the hard work. So they get these poor people, like across the Mexico border. They get the blue collar workers from the border. And then for the white collar workers, they're getting China, India. So what do the Americans do? I don't know. It's not a very sustainable solution. So they have to fix their own society. They have to fix their own education and focus on values. People don't, I don't know, people don't like to talk about values for some reason, but it's the most foundation of a society. Just like a family. If you want to have a good family, you want to have good values. And the same applies to society as whole. And in the US, but nobody wants to talk about values. It's like a bad word. And I think they're going to suffer in like about 10, 15 years.
The fall in general standards in STEM and other disciplines in education is directly related to the corporatization of education. So government no longer wanted to pay for it because they wanted to reduce government services. So, with Ronald Reagan and all that sort of thing, neoliberalism. And so then steadily education levels have dropped. And of course, I think France and Germany have resisted that enormously. But the UK, Australia, the US and other countries didn't, and they've dropped in the rankings quite rapidly. But now they're still very respected for their high quality education, especially in they made a lot of money with foreign students coming in paying very high fees. But now what you see, and this is very true in Cambodia, is that you have all of these foreign universities, and in China too, setting up their campuses in those countries. So this is kind of like the outsourcing of labor. Do you see what I mean? It's like, it's the same thing as sort of saying, okay, we'll close our factory and we will get Chinese to make the thing. Well, this is the same idea. Where basically our universities just can't quite operate properly anymore. So we'll just outsource the universities to the market, like directly to the market. And so there you have all these foreign-owned and foreign-run universities and schools. And in Cambodia, there's an enormous amount of foreign-run schools. But that's training up the Cambodia and other emerging economies are getting the benefit out of that. But in the meantime, it's stripping the advanced, or the more advanced countries in education. It's stripping them, and it means that students don't want to go and live there anymore. They're perfectly happy to come back to China or to Cambodia and make money here where their families are. And it also relates very much to immigration as just labor function. So importing labor, and that's if you want to maintain a very, very high labor or very, very low employment, I should say. Then you have to cut immigration immediately. And so you cut the lowest educated first and then the higher educated last. And I think you can see that is really what's happening in the world today with education.
Yeah, like if you look at, say, patents. So China became #1 a few years ago. And then they were like, yeah, but there's something called the WIPO, the international patents. And then China became #1 in that as well. And then similarly with the scientific publications. So China became #1 in the world in 2016, I believe. And they're like, yeah, but they're not so very high quality. And then China became #1 in the top, the 10% of the most cited articles. Then they're like, yeah, but the US is still #1 in the top 1%. And then China became #1 in the top 1% of the most cited articles. And then they were like, no, the Chinese are cheating. They're just citing each other. And then last year, China became #1 in the Nature Index, which is like the most published articles in the top 100 of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. So it's sort of the copium. Whatever China does, the US, the elites and the media, they try to console themselves as to why there's something, there has to be something bad with that, and it should not be so great about China. But they're just fooling themselves, the Australian, the ASPI think tank, which is all funded by the US military industrial complex. And they published these, they looked at 44 the critical scientific areas. This is like the AI, quantum computing, blockchain, nanotechnology, and so on. And they said, well, out of those 44, China is leading in 37, and so the US really has to get out of the delusion, and they have to fix themselves, and they have to accept the multipolar world and not just live in a fantasy of, we're the greatest nation, we're the greatest people, everybody loves us, we have democracy, oh my God, we have so amazing country. Come on, give me a break.
Pascal, hand up.
Yeah, maybe this is where it comes together again because of what the multipolar world actually is. And SL, the thing is not that, sorry, I just need to pin myself here. The thing is not that the US must stop saying all of that. The thing is that they kid themselves into believing a narrative about the world, which they constantly need to fix with just more patches. And that doesn't actually change the world. It just pisses everybody else off because you don't give anyone else recognition. But the multipolarity of the multipolar moment is the fact that these changes are happening and that they cannot be stopped. 50 years ago, something like India going to Russia in a moment like this, the Americans would not only have tried, they would have succeeded in stopping that through coercive measures or through, it's the carrot or the stick. But the carrots are not sweet enough anymore, and the stick is just not scary enough anymore. And therefore, these new structures are now emerging. So in a sense, what we have to think about is not how do we bring about the multipolar world, it's how do we support the multipolar world not decaying into world war. The cooperation between the different players is taking place, and we can see that, and the new structures are being built, and the economic backbone that is still needed with like settlement mechanisms and so on, they will emerge in one way or another because we have large enough markets of enough players trying to build them, and one or the other, or maybe 3 or 4 systems are going to emerge that will take over that function. The problematic part is to make the former power that is so used to calling the shots, let it go and let it happen without actually blowing it up. So that to me is the question, is how do we, from all of this hubris, and the hubris that then is framed in a way of everybody else is an enemy, how do we deal with that one and assure the Americans that, we still like you, we still want you to be part of the multipolarity, it will be fine, you will be okay, we will all work toward you also being one of the kids playing with everybody else, and you don't need to be. You don't need to act like this. And to the Europeans, is like how to tell them that you really need to get a grip. as in this absolute dependency on the top bully is not good for you. But that doesn't mean you have to turn around. What Orban is doing is he's not trying to shoot at the Americans or something. He's just trying to mend ties, and that's something we need to support structurally in order to get away from this brinkmanship, where especially the West is trying to do it in an all or nothing way. But the multipolarity itself will take care of itself. That's why it is multipolarity.
David.
Yeah, I just want to add one particular aspect to the education, since I used to teach at Texas A&M, both the undergrad and graduate programs. The problem we have in America regarding education is that education is a transactional here in the US. It's all about the cost. You look at the elites, the Harvard, the Yales, the Princetons and Stanfords and so forth, let alone the dark side of that. Where the problem institutionally is that the students are not taught to think, because when we are in the classroom, you have to now be worried about how the students feel, or rather how the students think. It's because the system itself became to the point of, you can have an honest debate. That was one of the reasons why I left Texas A&M, because it became clear to me that the institution did not want me to push students to start to think outside the box. And the whole reason for that is to make a point to them that there is a world out there. You need to understand you are not the only one dictating the terms on the global stage anymore. Why? Because the world has changed and we need to change with it. And this is part of where our problem here educationally, this is why we are going down. And American society, it pains me to see where things are going. It's not going well, I'll admit it, because we're not producing qualified sort of thinkers, if I may use the term. And that goes with the territory as to where the world is headed, and we are lacking behind. I just wanted to add this one to the conversation.
It seems so far that there's a couple of, just from listening to what all of you've been saying, that a multipolar world has a number of important features. In a sense, multipolarity is what it is, in that, you know, countries are doing their thing, but success within that environment depends upon investing in people and ensuring that a population has the skill sets necessary to contribute and to make the most of the transformations that are happening. That seems to me to be a pretty important piece of the infrastructure fabric, if you will. The second thing, it seems to me, related to that is obviously in parallel the need to develop pathways for industries to develop, real industries that actually do things that people value and need and want as part of improving their lots in life. And when those two things happen, an economy also becomes substantially more autonomous, in that it has a core, if you will, that it can rely upon. You know, a population with skills and industries that are delivering useful things at the right prices. You know, that's just an observation that I guess I'm making out of everything that everyone said so far. Hussein, any thoughts on that? I mean, you've spent your life in economic development, actually. So
yeah, I just wanted to say, this is my concluding statement, is that we need not to globalize NATO. We need to globalize the Belt and Road Initiative. Because as you said, what the world needs is infrastructure, healthcare, education, industries, agriculture, environmental, upgrading. And, you know, I just was thinking today, because in the 1990s, people were telling us in the Schiller Institute, we were wishful thinkers, because I was an activist in the streets here in Stockholm. I was also in Germany, and we were distributing leaflets calling for building the new Silk Road, that we should develop East Germany, Eastern Europe, Russia, and all the way to China, that France, Germany, and the United States should pull their technologies together to develop the world, and Africa, industrializing Africa. And actually, it was funny, because we produced the first ever comprehensive study of how the new Silk Road should look like. This was published in 1997. And
Wow.
actually, we had a blueprint for how it will look like, and what kind of projects that are necessary, including nuclear power, magnetic levitation, trains, dams, space technology, space cooperation on a global scale. And people thought we were a bit crazy because the way politicians in Europe and the United States were thinking were completely the other direction. But look at the world today. We do have a new Silk Road. We have the Belt and Road Initiative. We have the BRICS. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all these nations are thinking in these terms. One of the things that Modi and Putin agreed on was to build nuclear power plants, civilian nuclear power plant in Bangladesh. It was not only military cooperation. So scientific, technological, space cooperation, all these things, this is what the world needs. And this is not optimistic talk. This is what China, Russia, India, many other nations are working on. The only ones who are lagging behind is our countries here in Europe and the United States. And this should be a big concern for us because we are left behind, but at the same time, our leaders are saying, yo, instead of catching up with the others, we should stop the others from running away and developing. And this is what really a terrible situation. And I'm still optimistic. We can still, and I think this gathering is a good example that we are working for peace. We are still working for peace and economic development. And this is a fantastic forum for promoting these ideas.
And I wanted to ask you a question, actually, just thinking about economic development. And you mentioned earlier that the Philippines and Japan have entered into what is essentially a defense or a military agreement. Has there ever been serious discussions about an economic agreement?
Well, if you look at the Japan relation, Japan is one of our biggest aid donor in many ways, no? Though as far as economic is concerned and trade, I think it's still China that is our largest trading partner. But when you talk, during the previous administration of Duterte, you can see that most of the talks and most of the agreement with different countries is really towards economic development and economic prosperity, because I think that was the main objective or the main the main track of the previous administration. But in this current administration, this is the problem with the Philippines now. It's a mirror image in many ways of the United States. So if you see the United States as being crazy, the Philippines is a mirror image of that. And if you really look at the Philippines in Southeast Asian context and even Asian context, it's the only country that has inconsistency when you talk about policies, especially even if in foreign policy and economics. So with regard to economic development, it should be our priority, and we supposed to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and synchronize our infrastructure development, which is very necessary in our side, both the physical infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. But the problem is every now and then there's a change in administration, and it depends on the president. And at this time, the current administration is more focused on, and precisely because it's heavily influenced by the United States in many ways, it's more focused on defense and military cooperation with many countries, especially regional powers like Japan, Australia, and even an outside power like the United States. So you can see that instead of trying to capitalize our good relation with China and try to get more investment from China infrastructure-wise, we have a problem at the moment because our infrastructure is not moving. We don't really have new anything in the country at the moment. Our in terms of investment coming into the country, especially FDI, 64%, we lose actually around 64% of it. It's not, it's gone, something to that effect. So there is really a lot of challenges that the country is facing when it comes to economic development. It is precisely because, really, to be very frank, in the context of Southeast Asia, in the context of Asia Pacific, the Philippines is at the moment being used by, well, the United States as its proxy vis-a-vis China in this whole geopolitical competition and the assertion of the United States for dominance in the Indo-Pacific region, using the South China Sea as the issue, and even extended to, the Taiwan Strait issue. So in that context, most of our, well, from my observation, many of the agreements with regional powers or quote unquote with the United States and its allies in my country is geared towards defense, security, and military, and a little less on economic. and also we kind of lose the chance and even the opportunity that other Southeast Asian countries, like for example Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, they get so much from China in terms of investment, in terms of tourism, but we lose that much actually precisely because of the conflict in the South China Sea between China. It's intensifying. And behind that is, you know, the United States really. So it's really odd, you know, if you really look at my country, it's a bit odd that in Southeast Asia, almost all countries has a very good relation with China and even with Russia and with other regional powers or middle powers. But on our side, at this time, I would say this current administration, we really have that our relationship with China is deteriorating. We now have Russia, on the other hand, we're creating actually an enemy to a greater extent out of Russia precisely because of, you know, Zelensky visited the Philippines, and it seems like the current president is, you know, admires Zelensky very much in that sense, which is really crazy. And on the other hand, also the deployment of MRC, or, you know, the mid-range missile launcher in the northern part of the Philippines is also, I think, got the attention of President Putin. And even President Putin pointed out in June 28 that, you know, we know that you have that kind of military assets deployed by the United States in that part of your country, and we took note of that. And, you know, we are also trying to see, you know, what would happen, and we're also trying to think of where to deploy our military assets in the Asia Pacific to protect their interests. So this is really the crazy part.
I want to quickly
right now.
interject here about the importance of that. He took note of that in the context.
Right,
I just want to interject quickly, Anna, sorry.
yeah,
This
sure.
was really significant.
Yeah.
Putin took note of that in the context of talking about nuclear conflict.
Yes,
about where the missiles were. Yeah, so implicitly the Philippines had set itself up as a target.
Yeah, that is actually my article that will be published actually tomorrow as an opinion, because I'm writing also as a columnist in one of our newspapers, which is one of the biggest, I think, in the country, is all about that. That, you know, I mean, it took a Russian president to point out that, you know, we know that you have nuclear weapons deployed in the country, and it took
this is extremely disturbing.
To do that. For even us to be aware, because the whole country was not aware. Well, people like me knew from the very start, since it started with the Balikatan exercises with the United States, but the public is not aware of it. One very important and critical point is the media. Really, Western media is way much dominating the whole public opinion thing in the Philippines, and also the media really has to play a constructive role in trying to educate the people, because usually the Western media, what you hear from them is criticism against Russia, criticism against China, and all of this propaganda, black propaganda against China and Russia. And a country like the Philippines are very heavily influenced by Western values, and even very Americanized in that sense. Usually they don't think anymore. And it has something to do also with education, as you have discussed earlier, that, you know, education now in my country is also transactional in many ways. So people are not thinking, students doesn't know how to think critically, and they cannot even analyze simple things. So that is also a product precisely of the kind of education that we have. Our young people does not really think. So whatever the media says, I mean, the people in my country, they just believe, you know, even if it's wrong, even if it's misinformation and disinformation. So the Philippines is at its crossroad, but it's a critical country if you really look at peace and stability of the region. Because if in any case, it will not wake up, and it will be used against China or against Russia to spark something in the Asia-Pacific region using the South China Sea issue or the Taiwan Strait issue, then we will have a problem. That's why we really have to do something also and try to tell the public opinion in my country, because at the end of the day, politicians in my country are elected by the people. So still the people, at the end of the day, it's still the people that has the power to put people in power and to remove them from being there. So that is a very challenging situation right now. for the Philippines vis-a-vis the region, because this is not just a Philippine thing. I believe that everything is interconnected. What happens in one area, in one country, will affect the whole world and even the immediate region, which is Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific. So we are people like me are really facing a lot of challenges at the moment and working hard for Filipinos to wake up and for Filipinos to do something. Especially, we don't want our country to be dragged in a third world war, because that is the critical point at the moment. We're afraid that we will be used as a proxy for a war that the United States has been planning for longest time to weaken China, because they cannot defeat China. It's a home court. But to a greater extent, it will create a lot of problem. It's the same in Ukraine. Yeah, they will never be able to defeat Russia, but they were thinking before that they can weaken Russia. But look at Russia right now, a higher middle income country, as per the World Bank. But on the Asia Pacific side, we are Filipinos like myself are quite very afraid that we will end up in a confrontation with China over the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, precisely because of the American push and using us as a proxy. So that is a huge challenge that I think it's not only should be the concern of of Filipinos like myself, but the concern of everyone in the world, and even of people who lives in the Asia Pacific region. Yeah.
Certainly
Thanks,
have
Anna.
a favorable audience to that here. But if I could interject, I have to run to something. With a multipolar world, there's only two directions. One is consensus, and the other one is conflict. And the U.S., by providing bombs and everything like that, is clearly aiming towards conflict. China, by doing economic development and putting forward these principles, is looking at how to build consensus. And this is really the two major directions that are out there. And I hope you'll consider that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sana. But we might look to wrap up ourselves as well. I mean, it's getting on, certainly down in my part of the world anyway. So speaking a little bit selfishly, but what you described, Anna, made me think of a discussion that Pascal had actually the other day about Finland. And I don't want to open another vector tonight, but I think that there are some important parallels and lessons to be learned there, to be shared, and for people to understand. And perhaps I could, like I did last time, throw to Pascal for the last words, and perhaps to reflect a little bit about what neutrality might mean in this context, given the problems and the challenges of it, and how you sort of might sum up this last, let's just say, last 2 weeks of the world.
Let me keep this brief, but a lot of what has been said somehow connects to this issue of neutrality, and neutrality is not about just staying out and staying away. It's doing your own thing. So I think, SL, when you talked about India's position and actually standing up and saying, like, no, we have our own way of doing things, and we have a right to do our own thing. And that's what your foreign minister does time and again, and he does it brilliantly. But the pressure coming down on the neutrals is the oldest thing in the world, and it is usually the stronger part of a conflict that does that to the neutral, because the weaker part, and in this sense Russia is the weaker part if we look at the proxy war in Ukraine, right? And one belligerent is basically the NATO countries and the other belligerent is Russia, and it is fought through Ukraine. The weaker one structurally is actually Russia, and Russia has more to win of more states remaining neutral, whereas the United States has more to lose from them remaining neutral and has more structural power, so it will try to influence everybody to actually fall in line. And what we are seeing at the moment is that a lot of countries don't do that. India doesn't do it. A large part of Southeast Asia doesn't do it. Africa doesn't. South America doesn't. Now we have a few exceptions. The Philippines is one. The Philippines is falling in line, although I must say, the Philippines tried for 5 years under Duterte to accommodate with China, and that didn't fly either. So my big question, and maybe we can do this next time, is why is it that it's not just smaller countries are being bullied by larger ones, and the Philippines still is being bullied at the same time. So there is a reciprocal kind of thing going on still, and we need to figure that one out. But the danger of falling in line is, of course, that you become the next Ukraine. And I don't think Japan will be dumb enough to do that. But I am afraid that that there are other places in which political elites are more integrated with the United States, where something like that is possible. I am afraid that Finland and Sweden have now so completely switched, and that the Europeans are so completely flipped that they would be willing to become the next battleground. So my question to everybody is, how do we prevent that? How do we strengthen local resolve not to become a battleground and not to fall in line with anyone, but do your own thing? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Pascal. And perhaps on that note, we can wrap up officially, and we can have a bit of a chat afterwards as well about some of the next steps and what we can do. So maybe we can stop the recording.
Good night.
Thanks, Pascal.